Hollywood, the line between glitz and ruin often seems paper-thin. Few cases illustrated this more vividly than that of Robert Downey Jr., whose descent into addiction-fueled crime during the 1990s became one of the most infamous scandals in entertainment. Before he was Iron Man, before the billion-dollar franchises and critical redemption, Downey was a troubled young man struggling against demons that seemed larger than life, demons that would land him behind bars and almost cost him his career and his life. Downey was born in New York in 1965, the son of avant-garde filmmaker Robert Downey Sr. and actress Elsie Downey. He grew up immersed in the countercultural scene, surrounded by art, eccentricity, and drugs. His father was open about giving his son marijuana before he was even a teenager, a moment Downey later reflected on with sorrow. "When my dad and I used drugs together," he would recall, "it was like him trying to express his love for me in the only way he knew how." The stage was set early for a complicated relationship with substances. By the 1980s, Downey had transformed himself into a rising star. His talent was undeniable. He was magnetic on screen, capable of sharp humor, vulnerability, and explosive energy. His breakthrough came with films like Less Than Zero, in which he chillingly portrayed a young man consumed by addiction. The irony was that the role mirrored his real life more than anyone could have guessed. By the 1990s, Downey was both critically acclaimed and deeply troubled, trapped in a cycle of drugs and arrests. The spiral accelerated in 1996 when he was stopped by police for speeding in his Porsche along Sunset Boulevard. Inside his vehicle, officers discovered cocaine, heroin, and an unloaded Magnum. It was a shocking arrest for a man who had been nominated for an Academy Award just a few years earlier. The incident should have been a wake-up call, but for Downey, it was only the beginning of a chaotic downward slide. Not long afterward, he was arrested again, this time for trespassing into a neighbor's home. In a dazed state, he had wandered into the house and fallen asleep in one of the children's beds. The bizarre nature of the crime shocked the public and painted a picture of someone spiraling out of control, unable to tell reality from delirium. Judges grew weary of granting him leniency. After repeated probation violations and failed drug tests, Downey found himself in front of a system that had given him chance after chance. In 1999, the hammer finally came down. A California judge sentenced him to 3 years in state prison after yet another drug-related arrest. Downey, the promising actor once poised to inherit Hollywood, was shackled and sent to California Substance Abuse Treatment Facility and State Prison in Corcoran. For a man who had walked red carpets and mingled with the elite, the prison gates marked the lowest point of his life. Inside, Downey lived like any other inmate. Stripped of the fame that had shielded him for so long, he confronted the harsh realities of incarceration. He later described the experience as both humbling and terrifying. Violence was a constant threat. Fellow prisoners tested him, gauging whether the Hollywood star could withstand the pressures of prison politics. He managed to navigate it by keeping to himself and throwing himself into menial tasks. But the psychological toll was immense. For someone already fragile, prison was less a cure than a crucible, testing whether he could survive it all. When he was finally released after serving nearly a year, the scars were evident. Hollywood had moved on. Insurance companies considered him unhireable. He struggled to book roles, and when he did, his addictions often led to dismissals. In one infamous instance, he was fired from the television series Ally McBeal after being arrested again for drug possession. Directors and producers grew wary of attaching their projects to a man who seemed destined to self-destruct. The public, too, seemed divided between pity and scorn. Yet the story of Robert Downey Jr. did not end in tragedy. After years of turbulence, he began the slow climb toward redemption. Through intensive rehab therapy and eventually the support of his wife, Susan Levin, whom he married in 2005, Downey managed to piece his life back together. He credited martial arts, spirituality, and sheer determination with giving him the strength to stay sober. His unlikely comeback was cemented in 2008 when he took on the role of Tony Stark in Iron Man. The film catapulted him to global superstardom and redefined his legacy. The man who once slept in a stranger's child's bed after a drug binge was now the face of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The haunting question lingers, though. What if things had gone differently? What if prison had swallowed him whole, as it has so many others? His story serves as both a cautionary tale and a rare case of recovery. For every Robert Downey Jr. who manages to reclaim life after incarceration, there are countless others lost forever in the system. Downey's time in prison was short compared to many, but it marked him indelibly, a reminder that even the brightest stars can plummet into darkness, and sometimes, against all odds, claw their way back into the light. Wesley Snipes was once one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood. With his martial arts prowess, magnetic screen presence, and breakout performances in films like New Jack City, White Men Can't Jump, and the Blade trilogy, he seemed unstoppable. But while Snipes was battling vampires on screen, off-screen he was fighting an enemy of his own making, the United States government. His spectacular fall from grace would end not with applause but with a prison sentence, a reminder that no amount of celebrity can shield someone from the consequences of tax evasion. Snipes was born in Orlando, Florida in 1962. He grew up in the Bronx and studied at the High School of Performing Arts before attending the State University of New York at Purchase. His early life was marked by discipline. He trained in martial arts from a young age, and by a sense of ambition that propelled him into acting. By the late 1980s, he was on the rise, appearing alongside legends like Michael Jackson in the iconic Bad music video, directed by Martin Scorsese. Hollywood quickly took notice. Through the 1990s, Snipes established himself as one of the top action stars of his generation. His ability to blend physicality with charisma set him apart in an era filled with muscle-bound action heroes. The Blade films in particular cemented his status, creating a loyal fan base and generating massive box office returns. To the outside world, Snipes had it all: wealth, fame, and the kind of cultural cachet actors dream of. But behind the scenes, trouble was brewing. The issue was taxes, or rather, Snipes' refusal to pay them. Beginning in the late 1990s, he became involved with a group that promoted a fringe theory known as the tax protester movement. This movement claimed that income taxes in the United States were unlawful and that citizens were not legally required to pay them. Snipes, despite his success and fortune, bought into this idea. Between 1999 and 2004, he failed to file federal income tax returns altogether, even as he earned tens of millions of dollars. The IRS estimated that Snipes owed more than $15 million in back taxes. For years, his celebrity shielded him. Few believed that someone so prominent could truly be evading taxes so blatantly. But the evidence mounted, and in 2006, Snipes was indicted on multiple counts of tax fraud, conspiracy, and willful failure to file returns. The trial that followed was a media spectacle. Prosecutors painted him as arrogant and willfully defiant, while Snipes and his defense team argued that he had been misled by bad advisors. The actor even tried to settle his debts by offering the IRS a check for several $1 million, but the gesture came too late. In 2008, the verdict was handed down. Snipes was acquitted of felony tax fraud but convicted on 3 misdemeanor counts of willfully failing to file tax returns. The punishment shocked Hollywood: 3 years in federal prison. For a man who had played indestructible heroes, the reality of a prison sentence was devastating. In 2010, he reported to the Federal Correctional Institution in McKean, Pennsylvania, to begin serving his time. Life behind bars was a stark contrast to red carpets and movie sets. At McKean, Snipes lived among roughly 300 other inmates. Reports from the prison suggested that he kept a low profile, spending his time reading, writing, and practicing martial arts. Fellow inmates described him as disciplined and polite, someone who understood his place in the system and adapted accordingly. But make no mistake, the experience was humiliating. His wealth and status could not buy him freedom, nor could it erase the fact that he had fallen victim to his own hubris. During his incarceration, Snipes appealed his sentence, arguing that the punishment was excessive for the crime. The appeals went nowhere. He served the bulk of his 3-year sentence before being released in 2013. By then, Hollywood had largely moved on. Roles were scarce, and the actor who had once dominated the action genre now struggled to regain his footing in an industry that had little patience for scandal. Still, Snipes attempted a comeback. He appeared in The Expendables 3 alongside other aging action stars, and he continued to take roles in smaller films and television projects. But his career never fully returned to the heights it had once reached. The shadow of his conviction loomed large, a reminder that his downfall had been self-inflicted. He had earned millions and thrown it all away by refusing to comply with the most basic requirement of citizenship: paying taxes. The public's reaction to Snipes' prison term was mixed. Some saw it as a cautionary tale, proof that no one, not even a Hollywood star, is above the law. Others viewed it as overly harsh, pointing out that many wealthy individuals manipulate the system far more cleverly and escape punishment. But for Snipes, the lesson was personal. He once said that prison had given him time to reflect, to recenter himself. Whether that reflection translated into lasting change is debatable, but there was no denying that the experience had scarred him. The haunting takeaway is this: Wesley Snipes' imprisonment wasn't for violence, drugs, or the kinds of scandals that often sink celebrities. It was for something far more mundane, and in some ways more damning. He simply refused to pay his taxes, and in the end, it destroyed the career he had built so carefully. His story stands as a stark reminder that the trappings of success can vanish in an instant, not through dramatic betrayal or tragic accident, but through something as bureaucratic and unforgiving as the IRS. Mark Wahlberg's journey to Hollywood stardom is often framed as a redemption arc, a troubled youth who turned his life around to become a successful actor, producer, and businessman. But buried beneath that narrative is a darker chapter, one that many fans either don't know about or choose to forget. Long before he was a household name, Wahlberg was a teenager in Boston, whose violent actions would land him in prison and leave scars on his victims that never fully healed. Born in 1971, Wahlberg was the youngest of 9 children in a working-class Irish-American family. His childhood was chaotic, defined by poverty, family dysfunction, and exposure to crime at an early age. By his early teens, Wahlberg had dropped out of school and gravitated toward the rougher corners of Boston's Dorchester neighborhood. Drugs, theft, and violence became routine. He was arrested repeatedly, accumulating a rap sheet that reflected a pattern of recklessness and aggression. But the most infamous incident occurred in 1988, when Wahlberg was just 16 years old. High on drugs and alcohol, he attacked 2 Vietnamese men in separate incidents on the same day. In one case, he approached a man named Than Lam outside a convenience store and struck him with a wooden stick, knocking him unconscious. Later, he punched another man, Hoa Trinh, in the eye, leaving him with lasting damage. Wahlberg hurled racial slurs during the attacks, making the assaults not only brutal but racially charged. Police quickly arrested him, and the charges were serious: attempted murder. The court proceedings were a turning point. Wahlberg, still legally a minor, faced the prospect of significant prison time. The attempted murder charge was eventually reduced to criminal contempt, but he was convicted of felony assault. The judge sentenced him to 2 years in prison, though he ultimately served 45 days at the Deer Island House of Correction. For the teenage Wahlberg, it was a sobering experience. He later admitted that seeing hardened criminals in prison terrified him and made him reconsider the trajectory of his life. Inside, Wahlberg confronted the reality of incarceration head-on. Unlike the Hollywood roles he would later play, there was no glamour, no adrenaline-filled action, just confinement, regimentation, and the constant tension of being surrounded by dangerous men. The brief but harsh sentence was enough to shake him, though not to erase the damage he had already done. His victims, particularly Hoa Trinh, bore physical and emotional scars for life. Trinh has spoken about how Wahlberg never apologized directly, and how the attack remained a source of trauma. Upon release, Wahlberg faced a crossroads. He could sink deeper into the cycle of crime, or he could attempt to rebuild himself. It was his older brother, Donnie Wahlberg of New Kids on the Block fame, who offered him a lifeline. Donnie helped Mark launch a career in music, first as the frontman of the hip-hop group Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch. Their 1991 hit, Good Vibrations, made him a star, transforming his image from violent delinquent to heartthrob. From there, he transitioned into modeling, most famously as a Calvin Klein underwear model, and eventually acting. The narrative of Wahlberg's rise often glosses over his prison sentence, but it was a pivotal moment in his transformation. Hollywood, for its part, seemed willing to forget his past in light of his charisma and talent. By the late 1990s, he was starring in films like Boogie Nights and Three Kings, solidifying his reputation as a serious actor. Later, he would produce acclaimed series like Entourage and Boardwalk Empire, further entrenching himself as a Hollywood power player. Yet the ghosts of his past have never fully disappeared. In recent years, Wahlberg has faced renewed criticism for his teenage crimes, particularly the racially motivated assaults. In 2014, he filed a petition for a formal pardon from the state of Massachusetts, claiming that he had changed his life and wanted to use his story as an example of rehabilitation. The move sparked controversy. Critics argued that his success in Hollywood did not erase the pain of his victims, and many questioned whether someone of lesser fame would ever have the luxury of a pardon. Ultimately, Wahlberg dropped the request, acknowledging that his victims' voices mattered more than his own need for closure. Today, Wahlberg is one of Hollywood's highest-paid actors, a businessman with restaurant chains and fitness ventures, and a man who frequently emphasizes his Catholic faith and devotion to family. But the contrast between his public image and his violent past raises haunting questions. How do we reconcile the charm of the actor with the cruelty of the teenager? Does success and philanthropy truly atone for acts of hate and violence? The story of Mark Wahlberg's time in prison is not just about one man's redemption. It's about society's willingness to forgive, especially when the person seeking forgiveness is wealthy, famous, and charismatic. For his victims, forgiveness may not come so easily. The scars remain, a reminder that behind the Hollywood smile is a history written in blood and regret. Wahlberg may have moved on to a glittering career, but for those who remember, the echo of his prison sentence lingers in the background, a shadow that no amount of fame can fully erase. Danny Trejo is one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood, known for his rugged looks, iconic tattoos, and unforgettable performances in films like Machete, From Dusk Till Dawn, and countless gritty crime dramas. But long before he became a beloved character actor and cult icon, Trejo was a hardened criminal who spent years behind bars. His journey from inmate to movie star is as improbable as it is inspiring, a story that shows both the brutal realities of prison life and the possibility of redemption. Trejo was born in Los Angeles in 1944, into a family that struggled with poverty and violence. His father was abusive, and his neighborhood was filled with gangs and drugs. By the time he was a teenager, Trejo was already deep in the world of crime. He became addicted to heroin at just 12 years old, and his life quickly unraveled. Armed robberies, assaults, and drug dealing became his daily reality. By his early 20s, Trejo had already been in and out of juvenile halls and prisons, a cycle that seemed impossible to break. The most significant stretch of his incarceration began in the 1960s, when he was arrested for armed robbery and drug offenses. Trejo was sent to some of California's most notorious prisons, including San Quentin, Folsom, and Soledad. These institutions were violent, oppressive, and unforgiving. For Trejo, survival meant becoming tougher than everyone around him. He became known as a formidable boxer inside, earning respect from fellow inmates and guards alike. But even as he built that reputation, he was struggling with the same demons that had brought him there: addiction and anger. Prison, as Trejo has often described, was both hell and a strange form of education. He witnessed brutal violence daily: stabbings in the yard, fights that ended in death, guards who turned a blind eye or wielded power with cruelty. He lived with the constant awareness that every day could be his last. Yet in that environment, Trejo found something unexpected: a path toward change. He joined a 12-step program behind bars and began taking sobriety seriously. Slowly, he started to imagine a life beyond crime and addiction. In 1969, Trejo was released. By then, he had spent more than a decade of his young life behind bars. Many men in his position would have fallen back into old habits, but Trejo was determined to break the cycle. He stayed clean, working odd jobs in construction and as a drug counselor, using his own story to reach young people who were teetering on the edge of ruin. His scarred face, tattoos, and no-nonsense demeanor made him an unlikely but effective mentor. He understood the lure of drugs and gangs better than anyone, because he had lived it. His entry into Hollywood came by accident. In the mid-1980s, Trejo was working as a counselor when a young man he was helping asked him to come to a movie set to provide support. The film was Runaway Train, and Trejo's tough guy appearance caught the eye of the director. He was asked to play a convict in the film, a role that came naturally. That small part led to more roles, usually as gang members, criminals, or enforcers. Audiences loved his authenticity because he wasn't acting. He had lived that life. Over time, Trejo carved out a unique career. While many actors tried to project toughness, Trejo embodied it. He became a fixture in action and crime films, working with directors like Robert Rodriguez, who helped elevate him from background player to cult star. In 2010, Trejo headlined Machete, a film that turned him into an unlikely leading man. Beyond acting, he built businesses, including the popular Trejo's Tacos restaurant chain, and continued his work with at-risk youth, using his fame to amplify his message of recovery and resilience. But even as his career soared, Trejo never forgot where he came from. He has spoken openly about the horrors of prison, about the wasted years and the lives he saw destroyed. For him, incarceration was not a badge of honor, but a reminder of how close he came to losing everything. He often describes himself as blessed to have survived and turned his life around. Unlike many celebrities whose brushes with the law end in disgrace, Trejo's story is defined by transformation. He went from prisoner to counselor to movie star, and along the way, he became a symbol of second chances. The haunting reflection of Trejo's story lies in its rarity. For every Danny Trejo who makes it out of prison and builds a new life, there are countless others who remain trapped in cycles of addiction and incarceration. Trejo himself acknowledges this, often reminding people that his fame was an accident, a stroke of luck that could have easily never happened. If not for that chance meeting on a film set, he might have lived and died as just another forgotten convict. Today, Trejo is not only an actor but a voice for redemption. He visits prisons, speaks at schools, and works tirelessly to show that change is possible. His life is proof that even the darkest paths can turn toward light. But the shadow of his prison years lingers, both as a cautionary tale and as the foundation of his authenticity. The tattoos, the scars, the steely gaze, all are real, all born from a life lived on the edge. And every time he steps in front of a camera, that reality comes through. A reminder of the thin line between destruction and salvation. Tim Allen is best known today as a beloved comedian and actor, the voice of Buzz Lightyear in Toy Story, and the star of long-running sitcoms like Home Improvement and Last Man Standing. His on-screen persona has always been that of a family-friendly everyman, a man who mixes humor with warmth. But before Allen became a household name, his real life took a much darker turn. In the late 1970s, he was arrested in a drug bust so serious that it nearly ended his life before it even began. Instead, his time in prison became the crucible that shaped him into the performer he would later become. Born Timothy Allen Dick in Denver, Colorado in 1953, Allen endured tragedy at a young age when his father was killed in a car accident. The loss deeply affected him, leaving him adrift as a teenager. He moved with his mother and siblings to Michigan, where he struggled to find direction. Though he showed a knack for comedy early on, his adult life initially veered into reckless choices. By his mid-20s, Allen had fallen into the drug trade, a dangerous path that promised fast money but carried enormous risks. On October 2, 1978, at the Kalamazoo Battle Creek International Airport in Michigan, Allen's double life came crashing down. He was caught by federal agents with nearly 1.5 pounds of cocaine in his possession. The amount was far too large for personal use. Authorities charged him with intent to distribute, a serious federal offense. Facing the possibility of life in prison, Allen's future looked grim. His mugshot, featuring a shaggy mustache and weary eyes, became a haunting image of a man at the edge of ruin. The legal system offered him one way out: cooperation. Allen struck a deal with prosecutors, agreeing to provide information on other dealers in exchange for a reduced sentence. His cooperation drew criticism from some. but it spared him the worst of what could have been a life-destroying penalty. Instead of decades behind bars, Allen was sentenced to between 3 and 7 years in federal prison. He served a little over 2 years at Sandstone Federal Correctional Institution in Minnesota. Prison life was harsh, but for Allen, it became a turning point. He has spoken about the fear and isolation of those years, about how it forced him to confront his own choices. Surrounded by hardened criminals, he quickly learned how to adapt. He kept his head down, avoided conflicts, and began reflecting on the trajectory of his life. In interviews years later, Allen would admit that those 2 years saved him. They gave him clarity, stripped away illusions, and pushed him toward something more meaningful. It was during his time in prison that Allen began to seriously hone his sense of humor. Comedy had always been his coping mechanism, a way to deal with pain and chaos. Inside, he entertained fellow inmates with impersonations and jokes, testing material in the unlikeliest of venues. It gave him a sense of identity beyond being just another inmate number. By the time of his release in 1981, Allen was determined to rebuild his life around that gift. His path was not immediate or easy. Upon release, Allen had the stigma of a convicted felon hanging over him. Many doors were closed, and the shadow of his drug conviction loomed large. But he threw himself into stand-up comedy, performing in clubs around Detroit. His sharp observational humor and working-class relatability quickly won audiences over. By the late 1980s, he was appearing on television talk shows, and in 1991, his sitcom Home Improvement premiered on ABC. It became one of the most successful shows of the decade, making Allen a household name. Hollywood, in its typical fashion, largely forgot or ignored Allen's prison years. Disney, perhaps the most image-conscious studio in the world, even cast him as the voice of Buzz Lightyear in 1995, cementing his place in family entertainment. To many fans, Allen was the embodiment of wholesome comedy, the last person one might associate with drug trafficking and prison. But beneath the surface, his past remained a defining part of who he was. Allen himself has been candid about that past, acknowledging that his prison sentence was the wake-up call he needed. He has often spoken about the guilt of cooperating with authorities and the responsibility he feels to live a better life because of the second chance he was given. While others never make it out of the cycle of crime, Allen managed not only to escape it but to turn his life into a remarkable success story. The haunting reflection of Tim Allen's story lies in the duality of his legacy. On one hand, he is a beloved comedian who brought laughter to millions, a man whose career is defined by family-friendly roles. On the other, he is a man whose early choices nearly destroyed him, whose time in prison is a reminder of how fragile life can be. His story is proof that incarceration does not have to define a person forever, but it also raises questions about privilege, redemption, and the paths available to those who fall from grace. For Tim Allen, prison was not the end of his story. It was the unlikely beginning of everything that came after. O.J. Simpson's name is forever etched in American cultural history, not for his achievements on the football field or even his acting career, but for the crimes and trials that defined the second half of his life. While the infamous 1995 trial for the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman ended in acquittal, Simpson's freedom would not last forever. More than a decade later, he would find himself back in the courtroom, and this time, behind prison bars, convicted of armed robbery and kidnapping in a case that stunned the nation and proved that even a celebrity of his magnitude could not escape justice indefinitely. Born in San Francisco in 1947, Orenthal James Simpson rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most celebrated athletes of his time. At the University of Southern California, he won the Heisman Trophy and later broke records as a running back in the NFL, particularly with the Buffalo Bills. His charisma and talent made him a natural crossover star, and after retiring from football, he transitioned seamlessly into acting and sports commentary. By the 1980s, Simpson was a household name, appearing in films like the Naked Gun series and serving as a pitchman for major brands. But beneath the polished image was a turbulent personal life. His marriage to Nicole Brown Simpson was marred by allegations of abuse, and by 1994, their relationship had ended in divorce. That June, Nicole and her friend Ronald Goldman were brutally murdered outside her Los Angeles home. The subsequent arrest and trial of O.J. Simpson captivated the world. The trial of the century dominated headlines, dividing public opinion along racial and cultural lines. When Simpson was acquitted in 1995, many believed justice had been denied, though others celebrated the verdict as a repudiation of a biased system. Simpson walked free, but the stain on his reputation was permanent. For more than a decade after his acquittal, Simpson lived in a strange limbo. He was ostracized from much of Hollywood and the sports world, yet he continued to make headlines, often for the wrong reasons. Financial troubles mounted, and in 2007 Simpson's life took another dramatic turn. In September of that year, he and a group of men entered a Las Vegas hotel room, confronting sports memorabilia dealers whom Simpson accused of stealing items that belonged to him. The confrontation turned violent. Witnesses reported that the group brandished weapons, blocked the exits, and demanded the return of memorabilia ranging from jerseys to personal photographs. For Simpson, it was an attempt to reclaim what he saw as his property. For the law, it was a crime, armed robbery and kidnapping. The arrest was swift. Prosecutors wasted no time bringing charges, and the case moved forward with unusual urgency. In 2008, Simpson went on trial again, this time in Las Vegas, far from the media circus of Los Angeles. The evidence was damning. Audio recordings of the incident captured Simpson demanding the items and insisting that no one be allowed to leave the room. Several of his accomplices testified against him, cutting deals to reduce their own sentences. The jury deliberated for only 13 hours before finding Simpson guilty on all 12 counts, including armed robbery and kidnapping. The sentencing was severe. Simpson was given 33 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 9. The message was clear. This time there would be no escape from accountability. Many observers noted the irony that after walking free from a double murder trial, Simpson would ultimately be undone by a bungled robbery over sports memorabilia. For his critics, it felt like delayed justice. For his supporters, it was proof of a system determined to punish him no matter what. Simpson was sent to Lovelock Correctional Center in Nevada, where he would spend nearly a decade. Prison life was far from glamorous, even for someone who had once been one of the most famous men in America. Inmates described him as keeping a relatively low profile, playing sports, working out, and trying to avoid conflicts. But he was always a curiosity, a man whose fall from grace had been so public, so complete, that even behind bars he remained a symbol of celebrity downfall. In 2017, Simpson appeared before a parole board, making his case for release after 9 years. He expressed remorse, though carefully framed his actions as misguided rather than malicious. The board granted parole, and Simpson was released in October of that year. By then, he was 70 years old, a shadow of the athlete and actor he had once been. He returned to Florida, living a quieter life. Though he continued to generate controversy with his presence on social media and occasional public appearances. The aftermath of Simpson's prison sentence is complex. To some, his conviction in Las Vegas represented long overdue justice, a kind of karmic reckoning for the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. To others, it was a tragic coda to the life of a man who once embodied the American dream. His name, once associated with athletic excellence, is now synonymous with scandal, violence, and wasted potential. The haunting reflection of Simpson's story is how quickly success can crumble. He had everything: talent, wealth, fame, adoration, and he lost it all, not once but twice. The murders of 1994 will forever define him, but it was the Las Vegas robbery that finally stripped him of his freedom. His time in prison is a reminder that even the most celebrated figures are not immune to the law, and that the fall from grace can be as spectacular as the rise. For O.J. Simpson, the prison gates were not just a punishment. They were the final symbol of a life consumed by choices that destroyed everything he had built. Robert Blake's story is one of the most unsettling in Hollywood history, a tale of a once celebrated actor whose career and legacy collapsed under the weight of scandal and a crime that shocked the entertainment world. Known for his roles in Cold Blood and the 1970s television series Beretta, Blake was praised for his talent and intensity on screen. But off-screen, his personal life was chaotic, and in the early 2000s, he would be accused of one of the most infamous crimes to ever involve a Hollywood figure, the murder of his wife, Bonnie Lee Bakley. Blake was born Michael James Gubitosi in 1933 in Nutley, New Jersey, and began his career as a child actor in the Our Gang series before transitioning to adult roles. His career spanned decades, with standout performances that earned him critical acclaim and a reputation as a serious, method-driven performer. By the 1990s, though, Blake's career had slowed, and his public image was defined less by his work and more by his volatile personality and tumultuous private life. In 1999, Blake met Bonnie Lee Bakley, a woman with a reputation of her own. Bakley was notorious for her relationships with wealthy and famous men, often accused of pursuing them for money and security. She had a complicated personal history, including multiple marriages and children from different relationships. Her relationship with Blake was stormy from the beginning, but in 2000, when Bakley gave birth to a daughter, DNA testing confirmed Blake was the father. Reluctantly, Blake married her, though those close to him described the union as deeply troubled, marked by resentment and mistrust. On May 4, 2001, tragedy struck. Blake and Bakley had dinner at Vitello's, an Italian restaurant in Studio City, California. Afterward, they returned to Blake's car, which was parked nearby. Blake claimed he had left his gun inside the restaurant and went back to retrieve it. When he returned to the car, Bakley had been shot to death in the passenger seat. The bizarre circumstances immediately raised suspicion. How had someone managed to kill her in such a short window of time? And why had Blake conveniently left the scene at that exact moment? The investigation into Bakley's murder quickly centered on Blake himself. Prosecutors alleged that Blake had grown tired of his wife and sought to eliminate her, hiring others to do the job. Witnesses came forward claiming Blake had tried to solicit them to commit the murder, though these accounts were challenged for credibility. Still, the circumstantial evidence painted a damning picture: a strained marriage, financial motives, and a crime that seemed almost too convenient to be random. Blake was arrested in 2002 and charged with murder, along with conspiracy to commit murder and solicitation of murder. The trial began in 2004 and immediately drew intense media attention. It was Hollywood theater in the truest sense, with a former star now the accused in a real-life murder mystery. The prosecution leaned heavily on witness testimony, particularly accounts of Blake seeking out hitmen. The defense, however, attacked the reliability of these witnesses and argued that there was no physical evidence tying Blake to the crime. Indeed, no gun was ever definitively linked to the shooting, and forensic evidence was inconclusive. In March 2005, after months of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: not guilty of murder. Blake was acquitted, a free man once more. Yet the victory was hollow. While he escaped criminal conviction, the civil trial that followed told a different story. In November 2005, a jury found Blake liable for Bakley's wrongful death, ordering him to pay $30 million in damages to her family, a sum later reduced but still financially devastating. The judgment effectively bankrupted him, stripping him of what remained of his fortune and forcing him into obscurity. After the trial, Blake's life spiraled further into decline. Once a respected actor, he became a pariah in Hollywood, unable to find work and living on the margins. He gave sporadic interviews, often bitter and defiant, insisting on his innocence but acknowledging his life had been destroyed. The public, divided as always in such cases, viewed him with suspicion, unable to separate the verdict from the haunting circumstances of the crime. For many, the question lingered. If Blake hadn't killed Backley, who had? Robert Blake's story is less about the bright flame of fame and more about the shadows that fame can hide. Here was a man who had everything: talent, acclaim, recognition, only to see it collapse under the weight of scandal and suspicion. Whether guilty or innocent in the eyes of history, his reputation never recovered. He died in 2023 at the age of 89, his legacy forever tied to a crime that will always haunt Hollywood lore. The reflection that remains is chilling. Fame does not insulate anyone from darkness. For Robert Blake, the tragedy of his wife's murder and the years spent defending himself in court ensured that his career would never be remembered for its artistic heights, but for its association with one of the most notorious Hollywood scandals of all time. The prison of public judgment, even without a formal conviction, was one he never escaped.